Hello everyone, this is Brad Wood. This is the final video in the ModCFML support series. Again, ModCFML is the ability for you to use a single solitary CommandBox server, whether it's running Lucy or Adobe ColdFusion, to power multiple sites or multiple different web routes. By default, CommandBox used to just be able to have a single web route. If you wanted to have multiple servers, you had to have multiple CommandBox instances, but via the power of ModCFML, this is no longer the case. So I've already done a screencast on how to use ModCFML through IIS with bondcode, and a screencast on how to use ModCFML via Apache and the ModCFML module. And today I'm going to show you how to do with Nginx. Nginx was actually the easiest of the three to set up, but mostly because there was no special things I needed to install. It's just standard Nginx and a bunch of configuration. So the docs for this are here on the CommandBox site, ModCFML support. Again, when people talk about ModCFML, they're usually talking about a collection of libraries that kind of can be used together. There's bondcode, which is a plugin for IIS. There's the Apache ModCFML module. There's a Tomcat ModCFML valve, which we don't need because CommandBox has the equivalent functionality built in. You just have to enable ModCFML.enable. And then, of course, you can use this with Nginx or really any web server. There's no custom module. There's no native module built for Nginx like there is for IIS or Apache. So it's just a matter of you manually setting the right HTTP request headers, and then ModCFML inside CommandBox will pick those up and use it. And for that matter, even the Tomcat ModCFML valve would behave the same. So in your CommandBox site, you need to set ModCFML.enable to true. You need to set ModCFML.sharedKey to whatever your secret key is. This is a password that ensures that someone else isn't sending their own malicious requests to your CommandBox server directly. You want to make sure that you're only obeying requests from the proxy. This is very important for security because the web proxy is basically telling the servlet what web route it wants to use, and you don't want a malicious actor to be able to choose their own arbitrary folder off of your hard drive as the web route. So this secret ensures that CommandBox is only listening to the proxy you've configured. In our case, we don't need to use AJP at all. There's no real requirement of AJP, even though I used it for the previous two examples. We're just going to use a regular old everyday HTTP-based proxy, so I'm not going to be enabling that. So in the docs, if you scroll down, there's an entire section that says, what about Nginx, etc. And so basically, as long as you set these following HTTP request headers, ModCFML will work, because the bondcode module for IIS and the ModCFML module for Apache are really just, at the end of the day, setting these HTTP request headers for you. So there's the xModCFML shared key. This needs to contain the same value that you set in your server.json for the shared secret from ModCFML. There's the xTomcat.root. Ignore the fact that it says Tomcat. That's a poorly named header. It really just means whatever your servlet container is, which in your case is not Tomcat. It's actually CommandBox and Undertow, but that's just what the variable is called. So xTomcat.root needs to point to whatever the web route is for the site in question. That's how CommandBox knows where to serve traffic from. And then there's an optional xweb server context if you want to have multiple sites that all share the same context behind the scenes. By default, the host name, site1.com, site2.com will be used as the context. I'm going to ignore these xvdirs right now. They're a little complicated and there's only partial support for them. Anyway, so at the end of the day, you need to have something like this in your Nginx configuration. Proxy set header, xTomcat root equals path to whatever the web route is for that site, and proxy set header xModCFML shared key, which has whatever the heck your shared key is. So I followed the instructions here. To get to this is just I always forget the domain. I just Google ModCFML is what I do. I Google ModCFML. Here you go. ModCFML.org is the web page. When you click on it, it'll just redirect you to this bibliotech.github.io website. So they have an entire page on Nginx. How you install Nginx varies a bit based on whether or not you're on Windows or a particular Linux distro. Like my Apache example, I spun up a Docker container using Foundio Minibox just because it was convenient and already had CommandBox present. And so I installed the Alpine Linux version of Nginx, which has a slightly different folder structure, but it doesn't really matter because the configuration is the same. I copied straight up the configuration files that they suggest you use, which is a lucy.conf file right here, and then a lucyproxy.conf file here. So I'll walk through what's in these. These have a little bit more than you have to have, but I figured I would just use these examples because these are kind of production ready. And so basically you just configure that and configure your sites, and Nginx will proxy through. So let me jump over to the Docker containers so we can actually take a quick look at these. So inside my Nginx folder, first we have the lucy.conf file, which I copied out of the docs. This one I didn't touch at all. I just left it as the defaults. The important things that it does is it has some lockdown stuff to block the Lucy administrator. That's totally fine. ColdFusion administrator, no problem. It also has some stuff in place to make sure application.cfc can't be blocked. These are just nice lockdown things. Pete Freitag helped create these, so obviously he made them secure by default. And then if the request is to a CFM or a CFC file, then we're going to run the Lucy proxy configuration file, which is what has the actual proxy bits in it. And then we add index.cfm as a valid index file. So when you hit a folder that has an index.cfm file, it'll automatically run that by default. So that is the contents of that lucy.conf file. And then for requests to a CFM or a CFC, we run this Lucy proxy. And so here we have our proxy paths, which says proxy this request over to localhost on port 8080. Adjust this as necessary based on the IP address and the port that you have CommandBox listening on. I have CommandBox listening on port 8080 on localhost, so I left that by default. I had to comment out this line, I believe because I don't have the SSL module active in Nginx, and so this variable doesn't exist. And then the only other line in here that I touched was I edited the ModCFML shared key to say my secret, and that matches my server.json file. This is the magic which sets our tomcat.root, and it's just using the variable here to point to whatever the heck the web root is for the server. And the rest of this is just boilerplate. So don't really need to know much about it, but I copied this straight out of the docs. So really all I did was I added my secret in here. So that's the extent of the baseline Lucy configuration. Then I added just to the default configuration file so you can see them all in one place. I added 3 servers, which if you saw the Apache site or saw my Apache video or my IIS video, it's the exact same thing I did there. So I have a default server listening on port 80, whose web root is the app folder. I've set just the name default for its context, and I'm including lucy.conf because this is a file that I want to proxy to Lucy. It's worth noting if you're doing this with Adobe ColdFusion, basically everything should work exactly the same. I know these files are called Lucy. That's mostly because the documentation this came from assumed you were using Lucy. CommandBox makes no such assumption. So if you're using this with Adobe ColdFusion in CommandBox, absolutely no problem. Just rename these files to be CFML or Adobe or whatever the heck you want. They all work exactly the same. Except for the stuff that blocks the Lucy administrator. Those paths would be specific to Lucy. Okay, so I have a second site, which is specific to site1.com, and its web root is app/site1. And then I set the same name here for my Lucy context. And then I have a site2.com website, which points to app/site2. Pretty straightforward. 3 sites. Okay, so let's jump into CommandBox now. Apache is up. I have it installed. I have it started. I have the configuration in place. So in my current folder, I have index.cfm, which just says default site, right? And this is the folder a default site pointed to. I have a site1 folder, which has an index.cfm that it says site1. And then I have the exact same thing in my site2 folder that says this is site2. And we run a little bit of ColdFusion code just so we know it's going through our ColdFusion server. Okay, in my server.json, I've enabled ModCFML True. I've set the shared key to be my secret, which matches the Nginx, the Lucy proxy config file. And then I've set my HTTP port to be port 8080, which also matches the Lucy proxy config file for Nginx. So with that, we can start up our site. I'm going to start it up with the debug flag so we can see some of that logging in the console. And I'm going to start it up with the console flag just so we can see the traffic as it comes through. All right, server is up. When I started this Docker container, I mapped port 80 through to my local PC to port 80 inside. So Nginx is what's listening on port 80, so I can hit localhost. Whoa, caps lock is on. I can hit localhost on port 80 here, and that's, oh dear, Google wants to Google for it now. Bless your heart. Okay, http://localhost. There we go. So now I'm hitting Nginx inside my little Docker setup on port 80, and we've hit the default site, which is mapped through, and it's running our default site with Cold Fusion code. And if we look at our logs, it looks like we'd already deployed the default site. Yeah, it already created that default deployment here in the app subdirectory. And we can see here that the request came through localhost index.cfm. All right, that works as expected. I have a host file entry on my computer that points site1.com just back to localhost. So site1.com, now we're hitting site1. And if we look in our CommandBox logs, we can see that the request came in for site1.com, index.cfm. We created a deployment for site1, which pointed to app site1, and then created a new servlet context for Lucy to use, and we are running code from site1. And likewise, we can go to site2.com, which is also in my local Windows host file. And we're now hitting site2. Look at our logs. We can see here's our request, site2.com. Created a fresh deployment for site2, which has a web root of app site2. So this should all look very familiar because I did the exact same thing for Apache, the exact same thing for Adobe, for IIS. The only difference is this time it's Nginx. So default site, site1, site2, everything's up and running. So it's not too bad. Once you get the configuration in place, we can create any number of sites in Nginx, and the web root in Nginx will carry through and will be used in your Lucy or your Cold Fusion server. So the documentation, again, for the ModCFML portion is here. Their Nginx page basically tells you exactly what to create, where to create. I followed it, and it worked right out of the box. And then the CommandBox documentation is here at commandbox.ordisbooks.com. And as long as you're following those Nginx docs on the ModCFML site, really all you have to do in CommandBox is enable ModCFML, set your shared key, and punch in the port you want to use. So hopefully that gets you going down the right direction using Nginx and ModCFML with CommandBox. If you have any questions, ask in the forums, and happy Nginxing.